On the farthest edge of known space, the Threxian border outpost floated silently against the endless black, its metal skin battered by years of cosmic storms and meteor showers, yet standing strong as the first line of defense for an empire that had ruled unchallenged for centuries. Captain Velcor, a veteran of countless skirmishes, stared at the holographic display with a deep frown, his four hands moving swiftly across the controls as alarms began to blare in the command center. There it was, an unregistered ship, larger than any craft they had cataloged, moving at impossible speed straight toward them. At first, the crew thought it was a sensor glitch. Such speed and mass together made no sense, even for the most advanced civilizations. But when secondary and tertiary scans confirmed the readings, cold fear gripped the outpost. Ships that size didn't move like that. Ships that size didn't go dark and silent without a purpose. The Council was immediately alerted, emergency protocols were activated, and every available fleet was summoned. Velcor watched as dozens of cruisers and battle stations responded to the call, their weapons primed, their shields raised, their captains barking orders in tense voices. Yet despite the show of force gathering around the outpost, an unsettling feeling crept through the air, as if the galaxy itself was holding its breath. The approaching vessel, still refusing to answer hails or share identification codes, continued its silent advance, a shadow against the stars, unaffected by the threats or pleas sent its way. Its surface shimmered with strange energy fields, layers upon layers of unknown technology that even the most powerful scanners could not penetrate. Velcor found himself wondering who or what had built such a thing and what their intentions could be. It was not arrogance that made the Threxians assume themselves superior, it was history. They had charted and ruled vast territories, subdued aggressive species, and built alliances based on fear and respect. But now, faced with this unknown force, their ancient pride wavered. Every second that passed without a response made the outpost feel more like a target and less like a fortress. Discussions broke out among the command staff about opening fire first, about taking no chances, but Velcor hesitated. Something about the situation felt different, almost deliberate, as if the ship wanted them to panic. Deep inside, beyond military training and political duty, he felt the oldest instinct stir, an instinct that whispered one word: survive. As the ship approached within visual range, its details became clear. It was not elegant like Threxian cruisers, nor brutal like the warships of the Croth. It was something entirely alien, made with purpose rather than beauty, function rather than fear. Thick plating covered its surface, marked by deep scars and burns, proof of battles survived. No insignias, no colors, no broadcasts of strength or demand for surrender, only silence. Just when the fleets locked weapons and prepared to unleash the full fury of the Empire, the unthinkable happened. The ship stopped. No aggressive moves, no energy buildup for an attack, just a stillness that was somehow even more terrifying. Then, after a long and agonizing pause, a single communication flickered to life on all frequencies, simple and chilling: permission to dock. The voice was harsh, rough, undeniably organic, and unmistakably human. Velcor's blood ran cold. Humans? They were supposed to be primitive, barely crawling out of their cradle planet, insignificant in the grand game of the stars. How could a human ship be here? How could it carry such power? A small escape pod detached from the massive vessel, moving slowly toward the outpost. No weapons detected, no threats issued. Velcor gave the order to allow the pod into the quarantine bay under heavy guard, weapons ready but not fired. When the pod doors opened, a lone human stepped out. He was tall for his species, clad in battered, mismatched armor that had clearly seen more wars than the Threxians could imagine. He carried no weapons in hand, only a satchel slung over one shoulder. His face was hard, weathered, and his eyes spoke of things far beyond the reach of scanners or strategy, things that chilled even the bravest of Threxian soldiers. He introduced himself simply as Commander Holt and refused all ceremonial greetings or interrogation. Instead, he placed a small device on the meeting table and activated it. A three-dimensional map unfolded in the air, showing dozens of star systems blinking out one by one, consumed by an invisible, unstoppable force. Holt spoke in a voice that carried the weight of doom. Humanity, he explained, had not been idle as the rest of the galaxy had assumed. They had retreated into the shadows, growing stronger, preparing in secret for a threat that made galactic wars look like playground fights. A monstrous force from deep beyond the galactic rim, ancient, relentless, merciless, had awakened. It consumed everything it touched: worlds, fleets, civilizations. There were no survivors, no captives, only silence where life once thrived. The human vessel was not a warship. It was a last warning, a beacon of desperate hope sent ahead of the darkness. Holt had been dispatched to offer a choice: stand united with humanity and face the storm together, or remain proud and isolated, and be swept away alone. At first, the Threxian leaders scoffed. They were mighty. They had fleets, fortresses, allies. But deep inside, Velcor and others who had looked into Holt's eyes knew the truth. Pride would not shield them. Technology would not save them. Only unity, courage, and the will to fight together could give them a chance. Velcor made the decision that would change history. He extended his hand in ancient human gesture Holt had taught him and accepted the alliance. Across the stars, other empires would soon follow. In the silent dark beyond the map's stars, something monstrous stirred, growing closer with every breath. But this time, humanity would not stand alone. This time, the galaxy would fight as one. And when the darkness came, it would find its path blocked not by walls or fleets, but by an unbreakable chain of hope, forged in the moment when a lone human ship defied the fear of an empire and changed the fate of every living thing under the stars. The moment the alliance was made, the reality of the situation slammed into the Threxian leadership like a physical blow. For centuries, they had believed themselves invincible, untouchable behind walls of technology and fleets of warships, but now all of that confidence cracked, revealing fear underneath. As Commander Holt's ship remained docked, acting as a grim reminder of what was coming, every council member, officer, and civilian realized their lives had entered a new, terrifying chapter. Panic spread like wildfire through the corridors of the border outpost and beyond, reaching distant colonies and proud homeworlds that had never before tasted the bitter flavor of true fear. Velcor wasted no time, knowing hesitation could kill them faster than any enemy. He ordered immediate lockdowns, summoned all reserve fleets, and initiated ancient emergency protocols not used since the darkest wars of the past. Messages flew across the stars, carrying warnings, pleas, and desperate calls for unity. Most of the outer systems responded with terror, while some powerful inner worlds scoffed, refusing to believe that a human species they had dismissed for centuries could be the bearer of truth more horrifying than any empire had ever faced. Inside the outpost, the situation worsened by the hour. Supply shortages, technical failures, and sheer fear crippled the normal routines. Soldiers trained for precision now stumbled over their drills, technicians fumbled with repairs, and civilians demanded answers the military could not give. Commander Holt, calm and unreadable, offered what little comfort he could by sharing detailed reports from humanity's desperate resistance. His stories were not tales of victory, but of survival against odds so overwhelming that even hearing them drained the color from the bravest faces. Planets once teeming with life had been turned into silent graveyards. Entire fleets had vanished without a single distress signal. Only those who had prepared, hidden, and fought with everything they had managed to send warnings before being swallowed by the dark wave. Holt explained that the enemy did not seek negotiation, resource acquisition, or domination. It sought total erasure, as if life itself was an insult to its existence. Velcor assembled a war council, gathering the best minds from across their territories, including strategists who had never lost a battle and engineers who had built fortresses in the hearts of dying stars. They pored over every scrap of intelligence Holt provided, analyzing the patterns of attack, the failures of defenses, and the rare moments where humans had delayed the inevitable. It became clear that traditional warfare would mean extinction. Speed, adaptability, and unity across species would be their only hope. Great arguments broke out among the Threxian leaders. Some wanted to abandon their border worlds and retreat deep into fortified core systems. Others suggested sacrificing lesser colonies to buy time for the main empire. Holt watched these debates with cold eyes, finally stepping forward to deliver a simple truth: division would only speed up their doom. Either they would stand together, protecting. In the days that followed, massive preparations began. Old grudges between species were set aside. Rival empires that had not spoken in centuries sent envoys and fleets. Trade routes, once used for economic competition, now served as lifelines, transporting weapons, medicine, and critical supplies. Engineers worked around the clock to retrofit old warships with new shielding technology learned from human research. Scientists raced to create weapons that could at least slow down the approaching darkness. Fortresses that had once stood proudly alone now linked their defenses into vast interconnected webs, sharing energy, data, and firepower. Velcor personally oversaw the transformation of the border outpost into a command nexus for the entire defensive network, a place where species who once looked at each other with suspicion now gathered under one desperate cause. Yet despite all their efforts, an invisible clock ticked louder with each passing hour. Patrols sent to the outermost regions began to vanish, their last transmissions filled with static and the distant, bone-chilling sounds of something massive moving through the void. Refugees poured in from worlds that had seen glimpses of the oncoming terror ships, crammed with broken, hollow-eyed survivors who spoke of stars going dark, of voices being swallowed mid-scream. The darkness was no longer a rumor or a theory. It was real, and it was coming. Velcor realized that no amount of firepower alone would save them. They needed a weapon stronger than lasers or shields. They needed hope, unity, and the willingness to fight even when victory seemed impossible. Training programs were launched for civilians and soldiers alike, teaching new tactics designed by human veterans who had fought and survived against the darkness. Communication protocols were updated, ensuring no world would be left unaware or abandoned. Small, agile scout ships were sent ahead of the main fleets to serve as early warning beacons. Massive shield generators were built around key planets, designed to hold back attacks longer than normal defenses would allow. The Threxian architects even began constructing colossal mobile battle stations, fortresses that could move with the tides of war rather than stand still and be overwhelmed. Holt, though a guest, worked tirelessly beside them, sharing human strategies, warning against mistakes, and occasionally smiling in quiet approval when someone proposed a solution that even humanity had not considered before. As preparation neared completion, Velor stood at the highest observation deck of the outpost, gazing into the endless black where the first signs of the enemy would soon appear. He felt the weight of every decision he had made and every life now depending on him. This was no longer about pride, territory, or politics. This was about survival, about protecting life itself against a force that did not understand fear, mercy, or surrender. Beside him, Commander Holt stood silent, his expression grim but resolute. He placed a hand briefly on Velcor's shoulder, a human gesture of encouragement, and nodded. They were ready. Or as ready as anyone could ever be against an enemy that sought the end of everything. In the cold distance, just beyond the reach of their sensors, something stirred. A ripple in the darkness, like a breath before the storm. The final preparations were over. Panic had been conquered by duty. Fear had been forged into determination. Across the stars, worlds braced themselves, fleets steadied their formations, and warriors of countless species stood side by side, united by a single vow whispered into the heart of the galaxy: we will not go quietly into the night. We will fight. We will survive. The darkness had always been distant, something whispered about, something dreaded but unseen. But that distance was gone now, and as Velcor stood at the command center with Commander Holt by his side, the alarm sirens began to wail, filling the air with a heavy electric tension that made the skin crawl. Across the vastness of space, their early warning ships had picked up something: an anomaly, a distortion moving against the natural flow of the stars. And though the data was rough, one thing was clear: the enemy had arrived. At first, the screens showed nothing but empty blackness. But then, as they enhanced the feed, the shape emerged: a ship unlike anything they had ever seen, vast and cold, not designed for beauty or fear, but for pure, unstoppable purpose. It moved silently, absorbing light, distorting gravity, casting a shadow that seemed to reach across space itself, and as it came closer, every soul in the command center felt the same primal terror deep inside their bones, a warning older than reason, older than history, screaming that they were facing something that should not exist. Velcor gave the order to activate the outermost defenses, and the first volleys of missiles and energy beams were launched toward the invader, cutting through the darkness in brilliant arcs of deadly light. But as they struck the enemy vessel, they vanished, absorbed into its twisted hull without leaving a scratch. The defense crews hesitated for a fraction of a second, unable to comprehend what they were seeing, but Commander Holt barked orders in his sharp, commanding voice, snapping them back to action, and the assault continued, wave after wave, with every available weapon pouring fire into the enemy. Yet it moved forward, untouched, unstoppable, like a nightmare given form. The scout ships tried to maneuver around it, sending desperate data bursts about its structure, but one by one they simply blinked out of existence, erased without a sound, leaving only empty space behind. Panic rippled through the fleet, and even the seasoned veterans who had faced countless battles found themselves frozen, unable to process the sheer hopelessness of the situation. Then, without warning, the enemy ship released something, an object, small compared to its massive size, but glowing with a sickly, pulsating light that made every sensor scream with warnings. It moved faster than anything they had ever tracked, weaving through the defensive grid like a predator among prey, and wherever it passed, systems failed, shields collapsed, and life signs vanished. Velcor clenched his fists, knowing that if they allowed that thing to reach the heart of their defenses, it would be the end. Commander Holt, grim and determined, ordered a squadron of elite fighters to intercept it, personally selecting the best pilots, those who had trained relentlessly for this very moment. The fighters launched, their sleek forms cutting through the void, weapons locked and ready, and for a brief moment there was hope, a fragile spark against the overwhelming dark. They fired in perfect coordination, filling the space around the object with concentrated energy, but just as before, the attack seemed to pass through it, leaving it unharmed. One by one, the fighters fell, their ships crumbling into drifting wreckage or vanishing entirely, and the object continued its path, a silent messenger of doom. Back in the command center, chaos threatened to take over, but Velcor slammed his fist onto the console, his voice cutting through the fear like a blade, ordering the activation of the emergency energy nets, a last resort weapon designed to trap anything moving faster than light itself. Massive generators came online, sending invisible tendrils of energy across the battlefield, and as the object sped forward, it was caught, struggling against the net with an eerie, soundless vibration. Technicians worked frantically to tighten the net, to hold it long enough for the heavy artillery to target it, and at Velcor's command, the biggest cannons in the fleet unleashed their firepower, beams of concentrated destruction hammering the trapped object again and again. For the first time, cracks appeared along its surface, and the thing shrieked, not with sound, but with waves of pure terror that flooded every mind within range, making soldiers scream and clutch their heads as nightmares filled their eyes. Commander Holt gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay focused, barking orders for reinforcement even as the psychic assault battered him, and slowly, inch by inch, they began to win. The object shattered, sending shards of alien matter spinning into space, and the immediate threat was neutralized, but no one celebrated. They all knew this was only the beginning. The enemy ship, still untouched, loomed larger on the horizon, and with a sickening realization, they saw it was not alone. Behind it, more shapes emerged from the darkness, ships, weapons, entities they could barely comprehend, and the first contact had become the first battle of a war they had only begun to understand. Velcor and Holt exchanged a grim look, knowing that while they had survived the first blow, the real storm was only just starting. Across the outpost and through every connected world, alerts sounded, rallying every fleet, every soldier, every citizen to arms. The first contact with the enemy had not been a negotiation, nor an invitation, nor even a declaration. It had been an attack, swift and merciless, a warning carved into the fabric of space itself that the galaxy was no longer theirs to claim. Velcor ordered a full retreat to defensive positions, pulling the fleets back into tight formations where they could support each other, and Holt transmitted encrypted data packets to humanity's remaining allies, knowing they needed every second to prepare for what was coming. As they watched the enemy advance, their hearts heavy but their spirits unbroken, one thought burned bright among them all. They would fight, not because they believed they could win easily, but because life demanded to be defended, and even in the face of impossible odds, they would not surrender. Without a battle that the stars themselves would remember forever. The silence inside the command center was heavier than any roar of battle could have been, every officer and soldier glued to their stations, eyes wide and breath held, as the enemy fleet moved into full view, and it was only then, when the true size and shape of the threat was revealed, that they understood the scale of what they faced. Velcor stood frozen for a heartbeat, trying to force his mind to accept what he was seeing, because the ships were not just massive, they were wrong, like something pulled from the depths of forgotten nightmares, with hulls that twisted and shifted under their own gravity, structures that defied logic, and weapons that hummed with a hunger that seemed almost alive. Commander Holt leaned closer to the main screen, his hand gripping the edge of the console so tightly his knuckles turned white, and he whispered the thought that none of them wanted to say aloud: "They're not ships. They're creatures." A shiver ran through every soul present, because even as their instruments struggled to scan the approaching horde, it became clear that these invaders were not machines built by rational hands, but living entities, fused with metal and weaponry, blending biology and technology in ways that should have been impossible. The realization hit harder than any attack could, and fear, real and deep, seeped into the hearts of the defenders, because this was not a war they had prepared for. This was survival against something that should not even exist. Velcor quickly regained control, snapping orders that sent every ship into full defensive positions, every weapon ready to fire. But he knew deep down that they were fighting blind, facing an enemy they didn't understand. As the first wave of the enemy came into firing range, the defenders opened fire, beams of searing light and missiles cutting through the darkness, and some of the creatures were hit, their twisted forms writhing and splintering into chunks that drifted away, but others adapted, shifting their bodies mid-flight, absorbing the attacks or twisting around them like shadows made real. Holt coordinated the counterattack with calm efficiency, directing fire at the weak points they could find, but every victory was paid in blood, and it soon became clear that the enemy learned with terrifying speed, adjusting their forms to resist each new tactic almost instantly. Desperation grew, and Velcor ordered a risky plan, sending a heavily shielded probe directly into the enemy formation, hoping to gather critical data before it was destroyed. The probe darted forward, slipping between the monstrous shapes, its sensors blazing as it scanned everything it could, and just before it was crushed into nothingness by a writhing mass of tendrils and steel, it transmitted a single compressed file back to the command center. Holt and the science officers immediately began to decrypt the data, and what they found chilled them even further. The creatures were not a new threat, not an unknown species. They were a creation, an ancient experiment, gone wrong, abandoned by some forgotten civilization millions of years ago. Somehow, against all odds, the experiment had survived, evolved, and now it was returning to claim everything it could find. Buried deep in the data were fragmented records from long-lost explorers who had first encountered the creatures in the distant past and barely escaped with their lives, warning that these entities were not motivated by greed, conquest, or ideology, but by an insatiable instinct to consume, to absorb, to grow. They were living weapons without masters, without mercy, without limits. Holt staggered back from the console, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him like a physical force, and Velcor tightened his jaw, feeling the terrible burden of leadership settle even heavier on his shoulders. There would be no negotiations, no treaties, no alliances, only war, brutal and endless, until either humanity and its allies were wiped from existence or these monsters were destroyed. The command center buzzed with frantic energy as the information spread, fueling a mix of terror and grim determination, and throughout the fleet, captains and soldiers braced themselves for the brutal truth. Survival depended not just on strength, but on adaptation, creativity, and above all, unity. Velcor ordered an emergency council of war, linking with every major commander across the sector, and as holographic images of grim faces filled the air, he laid out the brutal facts with no attempt to soften them. "This is no invasion we can repel with brute force alone," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "We are facing the hunger of 1 billion years, a force that has destroyed empires older than our species, a threat that will not stop until nothing remains." There was a heavy silence after his words, but slowly, one by one, the commanders nodded, understanding that the survival of everything they loved depended on their ability to fight not just hard, but smart. Plans were made at a furious pace, desperate strategies and countermeasures discussed, and Holt suggested a risky tactic using bait ships equipped with experimental tech designed to disrupt the creature's ability to adapt, hoping to create small, exploitable windows where real damage could be inflicted. Velcor agreed immediately, knowing they had little time and even fewer options, and soon across the fleet, special task forces were formed, crews of volunteers ready to undertake the most dangerous missions imaginable. As the enemy continued its slow, unstoppable advance, humanity prepared its counterstrike, fueled not by hatred, but by the desperate, burning will to survive. Across the outpost, civilians were evacuated to underground shelters. Scientists worked around the clock to enhance weapons and shields, and soldiers sharpened their skills, knowing that every mistake could mean the end. In the center of it all, Velcor stood like a rock against the storm, his mind racing through possibilities, his heart hammering with fear he dared not show, because now he understood that this was not just a battle for their world, but for the future of all intelligent life in the galaxy. Every second that passed, the enemy grew closer, their monstrous forms blotting out the stars, and yet in the hearts of humanity, a fierce fire burned, a refusal to surrender, a defiance that no horror could crush. They had faced extinction before and survived, had risen from ashes and broken worlds time and again, and they would do it once more, even if it cost them everything. As Velcor looked out into the void, watching the enemy loom larger with each heartbeat, he whispered a promise to the billions depending on him, to the memory of those who had fallen, and to the very spirit of life itself. "We will not fall in silence. We will make the stars remember our fight." And with that, the final preparations for the battle to decide the fate of the galaxy began, the revelation of the true enemy sharpening their resolve into something harder and more dangerous than any weapon ever forged. The first waves of battle had barely ended when Velcor realized that victory alone would not save them, because even though the enemy forces were pushed back, the terrifying truth was clear: the monstrous creatures would keep coming, learning, adapting, and overwhelming no matter how brave or strong humanity fought, and something more was needed, something bigger than one fleet, one world, or even one species. As he stood in the dim command center, lights flickering from overworked systems, and the distant hum of repair crews filling the air, Velcor weighed a choice he had long feared, because there were old powers out there in the galaxy, ancient civilizations that had chosen isolation over involvement. Watching the young races struggle without lifting a hand, and reaching out to them was risky, but without help, humanity and its allies would be crushed. Commander Holt, bruised and exhausted but unbroken, leaned in and said what Velcor already knew deep inside: "We need them, whether they want to help or not." So, while engineers patched holes in battered hulls and medics fought to save the wounded, a special signal was sent out. A desperate message hurled into the silent stars, a call for help written in codes and languages older than Earth's own history, praying that someone, somewhere, would answer. Days passed with no reply, each hour stretching heavier than the last, while ships were repaired, weapons recharged, and grim preparations for the next wave began. And just as hope began to die, the answer came not in the form of a fleet or a message, but as a sudden tearing of space itself, a rupture of light and shadow from which emerged shapes both beautiful and terrifying. The newcomers did not broadcast greetings or threats. They simply arrived, their ships unlike anything the defenders had seen, shimmering like liquid glass, shaped like creatures of myth, radiating power so intense that even the monstrous enemy hesitated for a moment before continuing their advance. Velcor ordered full diplomatic protocol, even as suspicion gnawed at the edges of his mind, and a single envoy vessel was sent to meet the newcomers, unarmed, carrying only a simple message of truce and desperate need. Tension tightened across every ship and station, every eye locked on the silent meeting playing out in orbit. And when the response came, it was not through words, but a sudden pulse of information, a flood of images, emotions, and thoughts pouring into the minds of the chosen diplomat. The newcomers were known as the Varans, an ancient race so old they remembered the birth of galaxies as stories passed down from their ancestors, and though they had long withdrawn from the struggles of younger species, what humanity now faced stirred even their ancient hearts. They had fought these monsters once, in the ancient darkness, and though they had survived, it had cost them dearly, a loss that had broken their will to intervene again until now. The Varans offered a pact, not of subservience or control, but of alliance, forged in the understanding that survival was no longer a matter of pride, but of necessity. Velcor and Holt, along with the highest-ranking leaders from the battered Allied fleet, met in hurried council, weighing the risks and rewards, knowing that trust was dangerous but isolation was suicide, and after hours of fierce debate, a decision was made: they would stand together or fall alone. The preparations for the alliance ceremony moved faster than anyone thought possible, spurred by the knowledge that time was a luxury they no longer had, and on the scorched plains of Epsilon Prime, under the broken sky lit by burning wreckage, humans, aliens, and Varans gathered for the ancient rites. There was no time for elaborate speeches or endless rituals, only a simple exchange of blood and code, symbols of life and trust, as old as war itself. As Velcor stood with the Varan High Speaker, a creature of towering grace and silent wisdom, he felt the weight of 1,000 worlds watching him. And when the final vow was spoken, a deep hum resonated through the air, as if the universe itself had acknowledged their bond. The Varans immediately unleashed technology. Humanity could barely understand fields of shifting energy that could disrupt the enemy's adaptation abilities, weapons that sang through dimensions, and most importantly, knowledge of the enemy's true nature, gathered from battles fought eons ago. With the new alliance in place, the defenders wasted no time, rapidly integrating Varan tech into their ships and strategies, training soldiers in new methods of combat, and forging plans so bold and desperate that a few months earlier, they would have seemed insane. Velcor felt a strange, fierce hope grow in his chest, tempered by sorrow for those they had already lost, but blazing with a new certainty: they were no longer fighting alone. Still, the enemy was not idle, and soon, scouts reported that a new and larger wave of creatures was massing beyond the nearest dead system, a seething tide of horror preparing to crash down upon them with more force than ever before. Holt proposed a daring strategy strike first, hit the enemy while they were still gathering, using the combined strength of humanity and Varans to shatter their momentum, and maybe, just maybe, turn the tide of the war. Velcor agreed, and so, under the cover of darkness and drifting cosmic debris, the new alliance prepared its first joint assault, blending human courage with Varan precision into a weapon the enemy would never expect. Soldiers boarded sleek, alien-designed strike ships, pilots memorized maneuvers that bent the laws of physics, and engineers modified weapons to channel energy forces that had once only existed in theory. As the fleet moved out, silent and determined, Velcor stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the stars streak by, and he allowed himself a moment to remember the faces of those who had fallen, to honor their sacrifice by fighting harder than ever. Ahead, the enemy waited, an endless swarm of nightmare flesh and steel, but now humanity had a new strength. Seemed inevitable. Velcor seized the moment, leading the charge deeper into enemy lines, fighting not with blind rage, but with cold, calculated fury, every decision sharpened by the knowledge that the future depended on this battle. Holt's team unleashed the disruption fields, scattering enemy adaptations before they could evolve new defenses, while Varan ships twisted through space, carving gaps that humanity's forces surged through like blades. The battle raged for hours, the void itself seeming to tear apart under the fury of their clash. But by the end, as the wreckage of countless foes drifted silently into the endless night, a new truth was clear: the tide was turning. And as Velcor stood amid the ruins of the enemy fleet, his armor scorched and his spirit burning brighter than ever, he looked toward the distant stars and knew that they had done more than survive another battle. They had proven that unity, courage, and trust between different worlds could forge a strength that even the oldest nightmares could not crush. The war was far from over, but for the first time, victory felt possible, and humanity, together with its new allies, would fight to the last breath to seize it.